Some weights you carry with your back, and some you carry in your chest. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been head groundskeeper at Riverside Memorial Cemetery for 18 years. I've dug more graves than I care to count, moved more caskets than any man should have to, and I know the weight of death better than most. A standard burial weighs what it weighs. Casket, remains, personal effects sand after nearly 2 decades. My crew and I can estimate within 20 pounds just by looking. We know our business, and our business is predictable. That's why what happened with Mrs. Chen's exhumation still keeps me awake some nights. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late September. The Chen family needed to relocate Eleanor Chen's remains from Plot 47 to the new family section they'd purchased across the cemetery. Standard procedure happens maybe once a month, when families want to consolidate plots or move closer to other relatives. I pulled the burial records while my crew got the equipment ready. Eleanor Chen, aged 73, interred 6 months prior. Weight at burial, 110 pounds. Standard mahogany casket, bronze handles, basic concrete vault. Nothing unusual. I remember the morning was crisp, with that autumn smell of dying leaves and damp earth. My regular crew was there: Tommy, Rodriguez, and Jake, along with myself. 4 men, which is standard for disinterment. We'd done this exact job hundreds of times. I even remember Rodriguez joking about how we'd be done before lunch, maybe catch the game that afternoon. The family arrived while we were setting up the equipment. Mrs. Chen's daughter, Linda, and her husband stayed by their car at first, watching us prepare. Normal behavior families usually want to be present but keep their distance during the actual work. What struck me as odd was how Linda kept checking her phone like she was waiting for a call, and the way she kept glancing between us and the headstone with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not grief, exactly. More like worry. When we started digging, everything felt routine. The concrete vault came up clean, no water damage or settling issues. But when we attached the lifting straps to the casket inside and gave our usual coordinated lift, nothing happened. The casket didn't budge. "Must be caught on something," Tommy said, jumping down to check the corners. But there was nothing, no debris, no shifted concrete, nothing that would cause resistance. We tried again, all 4 of us putting our backs into it, and the casket moved maybe an inch before the strain became too much. That's when Rodriguez called out to the Chen family. "We're going to need a couple more hands here. Sometimes the ground settles and creates suction." I'd been doing this long enough to know that wasn't true. Suction doesn't work like that. But I didn't want to alarm the family, so I went along with it. Linda's husband and Tommy's brother, who'd been waiting in the truck, came over to help. 6 grown men, 6 of us, to lift what should have been, at most, a 250-pound load. And even with all 6, that casket felt like we were lifting a car. The weight was dense, concentrated, like something had been packed into that mahogany box with concrete. "You sure this is the right grave?" Linda asked, and there was something in her voice that made me look up from the work. She was staring at the headstone with the same expression you'd have if you'd found your front door standing open when you knew you'd locked it. "Yes, ma'am," I said, checking the plot number again. 47, just like on the work order. Eleanor Chen, interred March 15th of this year. Linda nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She kept checking her phone. We finally got the casket up and onto the wheeled gurney, all 6 of us breathing hard like we'd just moved a piano. The funeral director, Mr. Patel, was waiting with the transport vehicle, and I could see him frowning as he watched us struggle with what should have been a routine transfer. "Everything all right?" he asked me quietly, as we loaded the casket. "Just settled in there pretty good," I said, but I was already thinking about Mrs. Chen's recorded weight, 110 pounds. I'd lifted filing cabinets that weighed less than what we'd just moved. The drive across the cemetery to the new plot took maybe 5 minutes. Normal procedure was to transfer the casket directly to the new grave, get it positioned, and let the family have their moment before we lowered it into the vault. But when we went to lift the casket off the transport vehicle, it moved easily, too easily. Rodriguez and I exchanged looks. The 4 of us lifted it without strain, positioned it over the new grave, and began the lowering process. It felt normal, the weight you'd expect from a standard casket with an elderly woman's remains. "Did we lose something?" Tommy whispered to me, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. But lose what? The casket had been sealed, the handles were all intact, nothing had fallen off during transport. After the service concluded and the family left, I pulled Rodriguez aside. "You felt that too, right? At the first grave?" He nodded. "My back's still sore, but when we moved it the second time, light as a feather." We stood there for a minute, looking back toward Plot 47. The empty hole gaped open, waiting for its next occupant, and I found myself wondering what we'd actually lifted out of there. That evening, I went back to the office and pulled Mrs. Chen's complete burial record. Everything looked normal standard service. No special requests, no additional items interred with the body. I even called the funeral home to double-check the casket weight and contents. According to their records, Eleanor Chen had been buried with her wedding ring, a small prayer book, and a locket with her husband's photograph. Nothing that would account for the extra weight. But there was one detail that stuck with me. At the bottom of the burial form, in the section for family requests, someone had written, "Daughter requests. Plot remain undisturbed for minimum 6 months." I'd never seen a request like that before. Usually families want the option to visit, to maintain the grave, sometimes to add plantings or decorations. But the Chen family had specifically asked that the plot be left alone. The next morning, I drove past Plot 47 on my rounds. The new burial was scheduled for that afternoon. An elderly gentleman named Morrison, whose family had purchased the plot months earlier. Standard procedure, nothing unusual about the arrangement. But when I stopped to check the site preparation, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The earth around the grave had settled overnight, sinking down almost 6 inches below grade level. In 18 years, I'd never seen settling happen that fast or that dramatically. It was like something underground had collapsed, leaving a void that the surface soil had fallen into. I called Tommy and Rodriguez to bring more fill dirt, telling them we needed to level the site before the Morrison burial. But as we worked, shoveling load after load of soil into that depression, it kept settling, like we were trying to fill a hole with no bottom. "How much dirt are we going to need?" Rodriguez asked after we dumped the 5th wheelbarrow load and watched it disappear into the settling earth. I didn't have an answer, but I was starting to understand why Linda Chen had kept checking her phone, why she'd seemed so worried about whether we had the right grave. She'd been waiting for this call, this request to move her mother's remains. She'd known we'd find the grave different somehow. The Morrison burial went ahead as scheduled that afternoon, but I made sure to compact the fill soil extra thoroughly and noted in my log that the plot would need monitoring for continued settling. I didn't mention my suspicions about what might have caused the initial subsidence. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the funeral home. Linda Chen wanted to know if we'd noticed anything unusual during the exhumation. When I asked what she meant, there was a long pause before she said, "My mother was very specific about being buried alone. She was particular about that." I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her tone told me not to push. Instead, I told her the relocation had gone smoothly and that her mother was resting peacefully in the new family section. After I hung up, I walked out to Plot 47. The Morrison headstone was in place now. The grass was starting to grow back, and everything looked normal. But I found myself thinking about weight, how it can be measured, and how it can be felt, and how sometimes the two don't match up. I still work at Riverside Memorial, still oversee exhumations when families need relocations. But I always check the burial records more carefully now, and I always bring extra crew when the weight doesn't seem right. Because some things you bury stay buried, and some things follow you wherever you try to move them. And sometimes, late at night when I'm locking up the equipment shed, I'll glance over toward the far corner of the cemetery where Plot 47 sits empty again, waiting for its next occupant, and I'll wonder what really made Mrs. Chen's casket so heavy, and whether it was something she brought with her or something that was already there, waiting in the dark earth for company. Some routines become prayers, and some prayers become hauntings. My name is Elena Vasquez. and I've been the morning supervisor at Greenwood Cemetery for 8 years. I'm usually the first one through the gates each day, arriving at 6:30 to check the overnight security reports and walk the grounds before the groundskeeping crew arrives. It's quiet work, the kind that suits me, just me, the morning mist, and rows of headstones catching the early light. I know every section, every path, every tree that needs trimming, or at least, I thought I did. The security system was upgraded in late January of 2024. New high-definition cameras, motion sensors, infrared capability for night monitoring. The installation company promised us crystal clear footage 24 hours a day, protection against vandalism and theft. What they didn't mention was how clearly those cameras would show us things we weren't expecting to see. I first noticed the Tuesday morning visitor on the 15th of February. I was reviewing the overnight footage as part of my routine checking for any disturbances, animals, or maintenance issues that might need attention. The timestamp showed 6:47 a.m., and there, walking slowly between the headstones in Section D, was a figure in dark clothing. Nothing unusual about that, really. Sometimes family members come early to visit graves, especially on anniversaries or birthdays. They usually call ahead, but not always. What caught my attention was how purposeful the walk seemed, and how the person stopped at the same unmarked spot every time. I started checking the footage more carefully each Tuesday. Same time, same route, same destination. The figure would enter Section D from the east path, walk directly to an empty plot near the center, stand there for exactly 3 minutes, then leave the same way they came. No flowers left behind, no kneeling, no obvious signs of mourning, just 3 minutes of standing, as still as the headstones themselves. The clothing was always the same too dark coat, what looked like a hat or hood, walking at a steady pace that never varied. But here's what started bothering me. The face was never clear. In 8 years of security footage, I'd seen visitors, joggers, even the occasional trespasser, and the cameras always caught enough detail for identification if needed. But this person's face was just a blur, like they were moving too fast for the camera to focus, even though their walking pace was perfectly normal. I mentioned it to Jorge, our head groundskeeper, when he arrived for his shift one Tuesday morning. "You see anyone walking through Section D around 7 this morning?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Jorge shook his head. "Section D? No, that's my first stop every Tuesday. Nobody there but me and the rabbits." "What time do you usually get to that section?" 7:15, maybe 7:20. Why?" I didn't answer right away. The timing was tight. The figure left at 6:50. Jorge arrived at 7:15, 25 minutes. But something about the way Jorge looked when I mentioned Section D made me think he'd noticed something too. "Any particular reason you always start with Section D on Tuesdays?" I asked. Jorge was quiet for a moment, adjusting his cap. "Just feels like it needs checking, you know. Sometimes that section feels different on Tuesday mornings. Can't explain it." That afternoon, I pulled the burial records for Section D. Most of the plots had been purchased and occupied over the past 15 years, but there were 3 empty plots scattered throughout the section. Plot D47, right in the center where the Tuesday visitor always stopped, had been purchased in 1994 but never used. The original purchaser was listed as Margaret Holloway, with a notation that the plot was reserved pending family decision. I called the number on file, but it had been disconnected. No forwarding information, no updated contact details. According to our records, Margaret Holloway had never contacted us after the initial purchase, never used the plot, never even visited, as far as anyone could remember. The next Tuesday, I decided to be waiting in Section D when the visitor arrived. I positioned myself near the maintenance shed with a clear view of Plot D47, arriving at 6:30 to make sure I didn't miss anything. 6:47 came and went. No visitor, no movement, nothing. I checked the security footage later that morning, and there it was, the same figure, same route, same 3-minute stop at the empty plot. But I had been watching that exact spot, and I saw nothing. I watched the footage 3 times, comparing the timestamp with my notes from that morning. According to the camera, the visitor had been standing 15 feet from where I was positioned, at the exact time I was looking directly at that spot, but my eyes saw only empty grass and morning shadows. That's when I started losing sleep. I began staying late to review more footage, going back through weeks of recordings. The pattern was consistent every Tuesday at 6:47, like clockwork. But the more I watched, the more details I noticed that didn't make sense. The figure cast no shadow, even in the bright morning light. Their footsteps left no impressions on the wet grass. And most disturbing of all, the blur that obscured their face seemed to move independently, shifting and swirling like smoke, even when the rest of the figure stood perfectly still. I tried changing my Tuesday morning routine, arriving earlier, positioning myself in different locations. Sometimes I'd wait by the east entrance where the figure always appeared. Other times I'd stand directly on plot D47. It didn't matter. The cameras always showed the visitor, and I never saw anything. Jorge started avoiding Section D on Tuesday mornings. When I asked him about it, he said the place felt heavy those days, like the air was thicker somehow. He couldn't explain it better than that, but I knew what he meant. Even looking at the security footage made me feel like I was intruding on something private and sacred. On the first Tuesday in April, I made a decision that I still question. I called in sick and drove to the cemetery anyway, parking outside the gates in the early morning darkness. If I couldn't see the visitor from inside the grounds, maybe I could spot them from outside. At exactly 6:47, I watched through the fence as a figure in dark clothing walked along the east path. For a moment, I felt vindicated proof that this was a real person, someone who must have a key or know about a gap in the fencing. But as I watched, the figure didn't follow any of the paths I knew. They walked directly through a section where we'd installed decorative iron fencing the previous year, passing through the metal bars like they weren't there. I sat in my car for another hour, hands shaking, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Trick of the light, maybe. Early morning shadows. My eyes playing tricks after weeks of obsessing over security footage. But I knew better. The next week, I stopped checking the Tuesday morning footage. I started arriving at work later, after 8, giving myself plausible reasons to avoid Section D until the afternoon. I told myself I was being professional, focusing on more important maintenance issues. The truth was, I was scared. Not of the figure itself, exactly, but of what it meant. Someone or something had been visiting an empty grave every Tuesday morning for months, maybe years. The cameras saw them clearly, but human eyes couldn't. They moved through solid barriers and left no trace of their presence except for Jorge's lingering sense that something was different about that section on Tuesday mornings. I never figured out who Margaret Holloway was or why she'd purchased a plot she never used. I never learned why someone would visit an empty grave with such regularity and purpose. The security system still records everything, and I assume the Tuesday morning visits continue, but I don't watch the footage anymore. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried, and some visitors prefer to remain unseen. I've learned to respect both, and to save my questions for problems that have answers I can live with. But sometimes, when I'm walking through other sections of the cemetery on Tuesday mornings, I can feel something watching me from Section D, patient and persistent, as the sunrise itself. There are sounds that belong underground, and sounds that don't. My name is Robert Chen, and I've been running exhumation crews for Eternal Rest Cemetery Services for 15 years. I've heard every noise that comes with this work, the hiss of hydraulics, the scrape of metal on concrete, the wet thud of earth hitting wood. I know the difference between a casket settling and a vault shifting, between the pop of expanding metal and the crack of old wood giving way. After 15 years, you learn to read the sounds like a language, and that language tells you when everything is normal. The Henderson disinterment wasn't supposed to be anything special. Standard family relocation, moving the deceased from the old section to a newer family plot with better drainage. We'd done the paperwork, got the permits, scheduled it for a Tuesday morning when the cemetery would be quiet. James Henderson, age 67, buried 18 months prior after a heart attack. His widow wanted him moved closer to the plot she'd reserved for herself, which was thoughtful and not uncommon. I had my regular crew that morning, Martinez on the excavator, Collins and Walsh on the ground crew, myself supervising. The weather was overcast but dry, good conditions for the work. We'd started at 7 a.m. and had the vault exposed by 9:30. Everything proceeding exactly as it should. The concrete vault looked good, no cracks, no water infiltration, seals intact. Martinez positioned the lifting equipment, while Collins and I checked the vault markings against our work order. James Robert Henderson, interred March 23, 2023. Everything matched. That's when we heard the first sound. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the vault. Tap, 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 then silence. Martinez shut off the excavator immediately. "You guys hear that?" Collins and Walsh both nodded, their faces serious. In this work, unusual sounds get everyone's attention fast. We waited, listening, but heard nothing more. "Probably just the vault settling," I said, though I knew that wasn't right. Settling sounds different, more of a scrape or groan. This had been clean knocks, evenly spaced, almost like someone tapping on a door. We continued with the lift, attaching the straps and preparing to raise the vault. As the hydraulics engaged and the concrete box began to rise, we heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Same rhythm, same deliberate pace. "That's coming from inside," Walsh said quietly. He'd been doing this work almost as long as I had, and his face had gone pale. I called for a halt and had Martinez lower the vault back to the bottom of the grave. The sounds stopped immediately. "Could be air pressure," Collins suggested. "Sometimes when you disturb a sealed vault, the air inside shifts around and makes noise." That made some sense, except air pressure changes cause hissing or whistling sounds, not distinct knocking. But I went with it because the alternative didn't bear thinking about. We tried the lift again, raising the vault slowly and steadily. Halfway up, the knocking started again, but this time it was different. Instead of 3 slow taps, it was rapid, almost frantic. Knock, 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 like someone trying to get attention. Martinez stopped the lift without being asked. "Boss, I don't like this." Neither did I, but we had a job to finish and a family depending on us. "Let's get it to ground level and take a look at the seals. Might be something mechanical causing the noise." The vault came up clean, and once it was resting on level ground, the sounds stopped completely. We examined the concrete for cracks or loose fittings that might create noise when the vault was moved, but everything looked solid. The seals were intact, the corners were clean, and there was no obvious source for the sounds we'd heard. "Maybe it was echo from the excavator," I suggested, though I knew that wasn't right either. We loaded the vault onto the transport trailer and drove it across the cemetery to the new plot. Standard procedure called for the family to be present when we opened the vault for visual confirmation of the contents before reinterment. Mrs. Henderson was waiting with her son and daughter-in-law, dressed in black and maintaining the quiet dignity that families bring to these occasions. "Everything went smoothly?" Mrs. Henderson asked as we positioned the vault over the new grave. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Just need to do a quick inspection and then we'll have your husband settled in his new resting place." Opening a vault is delicate work. The concrete lid weighs several hundred pounds and has to be lifted straight up to avoid damaging the casket inside. Martinez operated the hydraulic lift while Collins and Walsh guided the lid as it rose. That's when we heard the knocking again. This time it was coming from inside the casket itself. Not the vault, but the wooden casket inside the vault. 3 slow, deliberate taps, just like before. Mrs. Henderson heard it too. Her hand went to her throat, and she stepped back. "What was that?" "Just the wood adjusting to the air pressure change," I said quickly, though my mouth had gone dry. "Happens sometimes when caskets have been sealed for a while." But wood doesn't knock like that. Wood creaks, wood groans, wood cracks. Wood doesn't tap in measured intervals like someone knocking on a door from the inside. We had to proceed with the inspection. It's required by law, and the family needed to verify that we had the right remains before reinterment. I nodded to Collins, who began removing the casket latches. The knocking came again as he worked, 3 taps followed by silence. Then 3 more. Mrs. Henderson was crying quietly now, and her son had moved to support her. "Maybe we should come back later," the son suggested. "Give my mother some time." But Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "No, I need to see him. I need to know he's at peace." Collins lifted the casket lid, and we all looked inside. James Henderson looked exactly as he should have after 18 months. The funeral home had done good work. His suit was neat, his hands folded properly, his face peaceful. Everything appeared normal and undisturbed, except for one thing. His wedding ring, which I clearly remembered being on his left hand during the original burial inspection, was now on his right hand. I'd been present at hundreds of burials and dozens of exhumations. I'd never seen jewelry move from one hand to another. Bodies shift slightly during settling. Clothing can wrinkle or displace, but a ring doesn't migrate from finger to finger on its own. Mrs. Henderson noticed it too. She stared at her husband's hands for a long moment, then looked at me with confusion. "Robert always wore his ring on his left hand," she said quietly. "Even when his arthritis got bad and his fingers swelled, he kept it on his left hand. Said it was closest to his heart." I didn't have an explanation. In 15 years of this work, I'd never encountered anything like it. Bodies don't rearrange themselves. Rings don't move between hands. And caskets definitely don't knock from the inside. "Sometimes things shift during transport," I said, which was weak and we all knew it. Mrs. Henderson reached into the casket and gently moved the ring back to her husband's left hand. As she did, we heard one final sound from inside the casket, a soft sigh, like air being released from a tire, or like someone settling into a comfortable position. We completed the reinterment without further incident. The family said their goodbyes, we lowered the casket into the new vault, and everything proceeded according to protocol. But none of us talked much during the rest of the procedure, and Martinez kept glancing at the grave like he expected to hear something else. That evening, I went back to review the original burial documentation. James Henderson had been wearing his wedding ring on his left hand when he was prepared for burial. The funeral director had noted it specifically because Mrs. Henderson had asked that it remain with her husband. There was even a photograph in the file showing his hands properly positioned, ring clearly visible on the left hand. I've supervised 43 exhumations since the Henderson disinterment. I always listen carefully now during the lifting process, waiting for sounds that don't belong. So far, the dead have remained silent, and their jewelry has stayed where it was placed. But sometimes, late at night when I'm finishing paperwork in the office, I think about that soft sigh we heard when Mrs. Henderson moved the ring back to its proper place. It sounded like relief, like someone had been waiting a long time for things to be set right. I've never told anyone about that detail. Some sounds are meant to stay buried with the people who make them. Some mourners come to say goodbye, and some come to make sure you're really gone. My name is Patricia Valdez, and I've been a funeral director at Riverside Memorial for 12 years. I've overseen hundreds of services, managed countless family crises, and guided people through the worst days of their lives with what I hope is grace and dignity. The work teaches you to notice details, the way grief moves across a face, how families arrange themselves around loss, the small rituals that help people let go. You learn to read people quickly and accurately because their needs change by the hour, sometimes by the minute. That's why the woman in the black coat caught my attention immediately. She first appeared during the Patterson exhumation in early April of 2024. We were relocating Margaret Patterson from the old section to the family mausoleum, a routine procedure that the Patterson children had requested after their father's recent death. As I supervised the crew and coordinated with the family, I noticed an elderly woman standing about 50 feet away, just outside the cemetery fence line. She was wearing a long black wool coat despite the mild spring weather, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, hands clasped in front of her like she was attending a service. She stood perfectly still, watching the proceedings with the kind of focused attention that suggested personal investment. I assumed she was a family friend who preferred to observe from a distance, which wasn't uncommon during exhumations. Some people find the process too difficult to witness up close. The second time I saw her was during the Kowalski disinterment the following week. Same black coat, same position outside the fence, same silent observation. This time I paid closer attention. She appeared to be in her 70s, with pale skin and sharp features. Her coat was well tailored but old-fashioned, the kind of garment that suggested both quality and age. She arrived before we began work and stayed until we finished, never moving from her spot, never speaking to anyone. By the third exhumation, the Rodriguez family plot consolidation, I was actively looking for her. She was there again, in the exact same position, wearing the same coat. The consistency was remarkable and slightly unsettling. In 12 years of funeral work, I'd never seen someone attend multiple unrelated exhumations. Family members occasionally observed their own relocations, but a stranger attending multiple procedures was highly unusual. I mentioned it to Carlos, our head groundskeeper, as we finished the Rodriguez work. "You noticed that woman in the black coat?" I asked, nodding toward the fence line. Carlos followed my gaze, squinting in the afternoon sun. "What woman?" I looked back toward the fence. The woman was gone. I'd been watching her just moments before, but now the area was empty. There was an elderly woman standing right there. Black coat, gray hair. "She's been at the last 3 exhumations." Carlos shook his head. "I didn't see anyone, Patricia. Just the Rodriguez family and us." That conversation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Carlos had excellent peripheral vision and rarely missed anything happening around the worksite. If he hadn't seen the woman, either I was mistaken about her location, or she was remarkably good at disappearing when people weren't looking directly at her. The following week brought the Morrison exhumation, a complex job involving the relocation of 3 family members to accommodate new cemetery development. The Morrison family, 2 adult children and several grandchildren were present for the procedure, along with their minister and our full crew. It was a larger gathering than usual, which made the woman in the black coat even more noticeable. She was there again, same spot, same coat, same silent vigil. But this time, something was different. Instead of simply observing, she seemed to be focused specifically on the Morrison caskets as we raised them from the ground. Her attention was so intense it made me uncomfortable, like she was searching for something among the remains. During a break in the procedure, I decided to approach her. It was unusual for strangers to attend exhumations, and I needed to verify that she had permission to be observing. I walked toward the fence, preparing to introduce myself and ask about her connection to the families we'd been serving. As I got closer, I could see her more clearly. Her black coat was beautiful heavy wool with covered buttons and a high collar that framed her face. Her skin was pale and lined, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She was watching the Morrison caskets with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not grief, exactly. More like recognition. "Excuse me," I called out when I was about 20 feet away. "Are you here for the Morrison family?" She turned to look at me, and for a moment our eyes met. Her expression was calm but serious, like she'd been expecting this conversation. She nodded once but didn't speak. "I'm Patricia Valdez, the funeral director. I just need to make sure you have permission to observe the procedure." Before she could answer, David Morrison, the deceased's older son, called out from behind me. "Patricia, we're ready to proceed when you are." I turned to acknowledge him, a conversation that took maybe 10 seconds. When I looked back toward the fence, the woman was gone. I walked to the exact spot where she'd been standing and looked in all directions. The nearest cover was a cluster of oak trees about 100 yards away, too far for someone to reach in the time I'd been talking to David. There was nowhere else to hide, no buildings or vehicles that could have concealed her departure. David joined me at the fence line. "Everything all right?" "There was a woman here just now. Elderly, black coat. Did you see where she went?" David looked puzzled. "I didn't see anyone. Are you sure someone was here?" I was beginning to doubt my own perceptions, but I pressed on. She seemed to be watching the procedure very intently. I thought she might be connected to your family somehow. David's expression changed. He looked uncomfortable, glancing back toward the Morrison caskets before answering. What did she look like? I described the woman, the gray hair, the sharp features, the distinctive black coat. As I spoke, David's face grew pale. That sounds like my grandmother, he said quietly. Rose Morrison. She always wore a coat exactly like that. High collar, covered buttons, heavy wool. She was very particular about her appearance. Would she have wanted to observe the relocation? David was quiet for a long moment. My grandmother died 20 years ago, Patricia. We buried her in 1994. The rest of the Morrison exhumation proceeded without incident, but I found myself scanning the fence line constantly, looking for any sign of the woman in the black coat. She didn't reappear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there somehow, still watching from just beyond my ability to see her. That evening, I pulled the cemetery records for Rose Morrison. She'd been buried in the old section in October of 1994, at age 71. The burial photographs showed a woman who matched the description I'd given David: sharp features, gray hair, dignified bearing. In one photo, taken at the graveside service, she was wearing a black wool coat with a high collar and covered buttons. The same coat I'd seen on the woman at the fence line. Over the following weeks, I watched for her during other exhumations. She appeared sporadically sometimes, present, sometimes absent, always in the same location when she did appear. Other staff members occasionally mentioned seeing someone near the fence line, but when I asked for details, their descriptions were vague and inconsistent. I began documenting her appearances, noting the date, time, and families involved. No clear pattern emerged, except that she seemed particularly drawn to exhumations involving long-term burials and elderly deceased. Modern burials, recent deaths, younger victims. She rarely appeared for those procedures. The last time I saw her was during the Henderson family consolidation in late June. She stood in her usual spot, watching with that same intense focus as we moved 3 generations of Henderson remains to the new family section. When the work was finished and the families had left, I walked to the fence line again. This time, I didn't try to approach her directly. Instead, I stood about 30 feet away and simply watched. She remained motionless for several minutes, then slowly turned and walked away along the fence line until she disappeared behind the groundskeeper's shed. I followed her path, but when I reached the shed, she was nowhere to be seen. The area behind the building was open ground with nowhere to hide, and the fence continued unbroken for another 100 yards. I never saw the woman in the black coat again after that day. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter, and the exhumation season continued without her silent presence. Sometimes I find myself glancing toward the fence line during procedures, half expecting to see that familiar silhouette watching from the periphery. I've never mentioned Rose Morrison to other family members during subsequent exhumations. Some information is too unsettling to share, even when it might provide comfort to believe that loved ones continue to watch over us. But I think about her often, especially during winter procedures when the air is cold and mourners bundle up in heavy coats. I wonder what draws some spirits back to witness the final movement of the dead, and whether that kind of watching is born from love or from something darker than need to ensure that some departures are truly final. Weight is honest in ways that words never are. My name is Vincent Torres, and I've been driving transport for Peaceful Transitions funeral services for 9 years. I move the dead from funeral homes to cemeteries, from old burial sites to new ones, sometimes from morgues to preparation facilities. It's steady work that pays well and doesn't require much conversation, which suits me fine. The dead are reliable passengers. They don't complain about the route, don't ask to stop for coffee, and they always arrive exactly where they're supposed to go. In 9 years, I've transported over 2,000 caskets, urns, and burial containers. I know the weight of grief by how families move around a hearse, the weight of different wood types by how the casket handles during loading, and the weight of a body by the way the vehicle settles when we take on a passenger. After 9 years, You develop an instinct for these things, a physical memory that tells you when something feels wrong. The Kowalski transfer felt wrong from the moment we loaded the casket. The call came in on a Wednesday morning in late October of 2024. Standard relocation job moving Theodore Kowalski from Hillcrest Memorial to the new Eternal Gardens Cemetery, where his family had purchased a plot closer to their home. According to my work order, Mr. Kowalski had been buried at Hillcrest for 8 months after dying of complications from diabetes. He was 74 years old, and his burial weight was listed as 180 pounds. I arrived at Hillcrest at 9 a.m. to coordinate with their exhumation crew. The morning was overcast and cold, with that sharp November air that makes everything feel brittle. The crew had already raised the vault and was preparing to transfer the casket to my vehicle. Standard mahogany casket, bronze handles, nothing unusual about the construction or condition. But when 4 of us lifted it onto the transport gurney, something was immediately wrong. The casket was too light. Not slightly light, not lighter than expected, but dramatically, impossibly light. It felt like we were lifting an empty box. I've transported enough caskets to know that a 180-pound man in a standard mahogany casket should create a total weight of around 300 pounds. What we lifted felt like it weighed maybe 50 pounds, if that. I stopped the loading and asked the crew chief to double-check the casket identification. Theodore Kowalski, interred March 15, 2024, he confirmed, reading from the vault markings. This is definitely the right one. You sure nothing's wrong with the casket? Feels way too light. The crew chief, a guy named Morrison who'd been doing exhumations longer than I'd been driving transport, frowned and helped us lift the casket again. That is strange, he admitted, but the seals look good. No damage to the casket. No sign of any problems. Sometimes sometimes decomposition affects the weight. That wasn't right either. 8 months wasn't long enough for the kind of tissue loss that would account for a 130-pound difference. But I didn't want to delay the job arguing about biology, so we loaded the casket and secured it for transport. The drive to Eternal Gardens took 35 minutes through suburban traffic. Normally, I can feel the weight of a casket during acceleration and braking, the way it affects the vehicle's balance. But during the Kowalski transport, my hearse handled like it was empty. No shift in the rear suspension, no change in braking distance, nothing to indicate I was carrying a substantial load. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the casket had somehow shifted or fallen off the gurney, but it remained securely strapped in place. It just didn't feel like it was there. The Kowalski family was waiting at Eternal Gardens when I arrived. Mrs. Kowalski, 2 adult children, and what looked like a grandson, all dressed in black and maintaining the quiet composure that families bring to these occasions. I introduced myself and explained that we'd transfer the casket directly to the prepared gravesite. "Everything went smoothly at Hillcrest?" Mrs. Kowalski asked. "Yes, ma'am. Your husband is ready for his new resting place." When we unloaded the casket at the gravesite, the weight issue became even more pronounced. The Eternal Gardens crew and I lifted it off the transport gurney, and it felt like we were handling an empty container. One of their guys, a young man who looked like he was new to the work, actually stumbled slightly because he'd been expecting normal weight. "Careful there," I said automatically, but I was thinking the same thing. The casket felt wrong. We positioned it over the prepared grave and began the lowering process. That's when I noticed the sound, or rather, the lack of sound. When you lower a properly weighted casket into a grave, it makes contact with the vault bottom with a definite thudwood and metal and weight settling into place. But when we lowered Mr. Kowalski's casket, it touched down with barely a whisper, like setting down an empty box. Mrs. Kowalski and her family gathered around the grave for a brief prayer. I stood back, giving them privacy, but I found myself staring at the casket. From above, it looked normal proper dimensions, good finish, appropriate hardware. But my hands remembered how light it had felt, how easily it moved, how silently it settled. After the prayer concluded, Mrs. Kowalski approached me. "Thank you for taking such good care of Theodore," she said. He would have appreciated the gentle handling. "Of course, ma'am. Is there anything else you need?" She shook her head. "No, we're satisfied. He's where he belongs now." The family thanked the cemetery crew and walked back to their cars without lingering. No final words at the grave. No last looks back. No emotional difficulty leaving. They just got in their vehicles and drove away, which struck me as unusual. Most families need a few extra minutes at a new burial site, time to adjust to the change of location. I was finishing my paperwork when the Eternal Gardens supervisor, a woman named Sarah Chen, approached me. "Vincent, can I ask you something? That casket felt unusually light to you too, right?" "Yeah, it did. Way too light for what the records showed." "Any idea what might cause that? I've been doing this for 12 years and I've never handled anything like it." I didn't have an answer. In 9 years of transport work, I'd never encountered anything similar. Bodies don't just disappear from sealed caskets, and caskets don't lose 130 pounds during an 8-month burial. That evening, I called Hillcrest Memorial to ask about the exhumation. I spoke with Morrison, the crew chief who'd supervised the vault opening. "Everything looked normal when you opened it up?" I asked. "Yeah, standard procedure. Vault was intact. Casket seals were good. No water infiltration or damage." "Why?" "That casket felt empty during transport, like there was nothing in it." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "You know, now that you mention it, when we first lifted it out of the vault, it did seem lighter than expected. But everything looked right, so we figured. I don't know what we figured." "You opened the casket to verify contents?" "No, that's not standard for relocations unless the family requests it. The paperwork was in order, the identification matched, and there were no signs of tampering. We just assumed everything was as it should be." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about weight and absence, about the difference between what should be and what is. In 9 years, I'd developed a sense for the physics of death, how much grief weighs, how loss affects the way people move, how the dead settle into their final positions. But I'd never encountered the weight of nothing, the presence of absence. A few weeks later, I had occasion to drive past Eternal Gardens and stop to check on the Kowalski grave. The headstone was in place, the grass was growing back, and everything looked normal and well-maintained. But I found myself wondering what was actually buried there, and whether the Kowalski family knew more about their father's final disposition than they'd let on. I still transport the dead, still judge weight by feel and experience. But I pay closer attention now to the families who don't look back, who accept unusual circumstances without question, who seem relieved rather than sorrowful when the work is finished. Because sometimes the heaviest thing you can carry is the knowledge that some caskets are meant to be empty, and some burials are less about laying someone to rest than about making sure they stay that way. The dead keep their secrets better than the living, until they decide not to. My name is Claire Hendricks, and I've been a mortuary assistant at Serenity Funeral Home for 7 years. I work primarily in preparation and presentation, helping families see their loved ones as they want to remember them, making sure the final viewing provides comfort rather than distress. It's detail work that requires both technical skill and emotional sensitivity, because families remember everything about those last moments. Every fold of clothing, every positioning of hands, every expression on a face becomes part of their permanent memory. That's why I photograph everything before a burial, not for morbid reasons, but for documentation. Families sometimes request changes during viewings, or they want confirmation that their instructions were followed exactly. The photographs provide both legal protection and peace of mind. In 7 years, I've taken thousands of these documentation photos, and I've learned to capture the dignity and peace that families hope to see in death. The Davidson case started as a routine reinterment. Helen Davidson had been buried in our cemetery 18 months earlier after a long battle with cancer. She was 79, had lived a full life, and her family had chosen a beautiful mahogany casket with white satin interior. The viewing had been well attended, and I remembered her family commenting on how peaceful she looked, how the preparation had captured her gentle nature perfectly. The reinterment was requested by her daughter, Margaret, who wanted to move her mother to a family plot that had become available in a more prestigious section of the cemetery. Standard procedure required opening the casket for family verification before the relocation, just to confirm that we were moving the correct remains and that everything was in acceptable condition. I was assigned to assist with the inspection because I'd been the primary technician for Mrs. Davidson's original preparation. I knew her case well, remembered the care we'd taken with her makeup and positioning, and I had the complete documentation file, including the burial photographs. The exhumation crew raised the vault on a crisp morning in early November of 2024. The concrete vault showed no signs of water infiltration or damage, and the casket appeared to be in excellent condition. Margaret Davidson was present with her husband and adult son, maintaining the composed dignity that had characterized the family throughout their mother's illness and death. Before opening the casket, I reviewed my documentation with Margaret to prepare her for what she might see. After 18 months, some changes were expected: settling, slight discoloration, possible fabric staining. I explained that these were normal processes and didn't reflect any problems with our service. "I just want to make sure she's still at peace," Margaret said. "Mother was so particular about her appearance. I want to know she looks right." I opened the casket carefully, lifting the upper portion to reveal Mrs. Davidson's face and upper body. The preservation was excellent, better than I'd expected for an 18-month burial. Her skin tone was good, her hair remained neat, and her hands were still properly positioned. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for one detail that made me pause. Mrs. Davidson was smiling. Not the peaceful, neutral expression I remembered from the burial preparation, but a distinct, subtle smile. The corners of her mouth were turned up just slightly, creating an expression that looked almost amused. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't grotesque, just a faint upward curve that hadn't been there before. I glanced quickly at my documentation photos, checking the original positioning. In every burial photograph, Mrs. Davidson's mouth was straight, lips gently closed, expression serene but neutral. The photos were time-stamped just hours before the burial service, and they clearly showed a different facial expression than what I was looking at now. "She looks wonderful," Margaret said, leaning over the casket. "So peaceful. And she's—" Margaret stopped mid-sentence, staring at her mother's face. "Is everything all right?" I asked. Margaret continued staring for a long moment before speaking again. "She's smiling. Just a little, but she's definitely smiling." I nodded carefully. Sometimes settling can change facial positioning slightly. It's not uncommon. But that wasn't true. Settling doesn't create expressions. It only softens them. Muscles don't reorganize themselves into new positions 18 months after death. And the smile I was looking at wasn't the result of tissue shifting. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. Margaret reached out as if to touch her mother's face, then stopped herself. "She always smiled like that when she was keeping a secret," she whispered. That exact expression, like she knew something no one else knew. The comment sent a chill through me. In 7 years of preparation work, I'd never heard a family member suggest that a post-mortem expression reflected the personality of the deceased. Faces in death are masks, emptied of the consciousness that gave them meaning. They don't carry forward personality traits or emotional states. "What kind of secrets?" Margaret's husband asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. "Nothing important. Just, Mother always knew things before other people did. Family news, neighborhood gossip, who was dating whom. She'd get that little smile when she was waiting for the right moment to share information." I found myself studying Mrs. Davidson's face more carefully. The smile was subtle but unmistakable, and the more I looked at it, the more it seemed intentional. Not the random result of tissue settling, but a deliberate expression frozen at the moment of, what? Death? Or something that happened after? "Did your mother mention anything before she passed?" I asked. "Any unfinished business or information she wanted to share?" Margaret considered the question. She was very secretive in her final weeks, kept asking about the family plot arrangements, wanted to know exactly who would be buried where. She seemed to have specific preferences about location, but she wouldn't explain why. The inspection continued without further comment, but I couldn't stop looking at that smile. It remained constant throughout the procedure, not changing, not fading, just a persistent expression of quiet amusement that shouldn't have been possible. As we prepared to close the casket for relocation, Margaret leaned down one final time. "What's your secret now, Mother?" she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear her. For just a moment, I could have sworn the smile deepened slightly. Not enough to be certain, not enough to mention to the family, but enough to make me step back from the casket and suggest that we proceed with the closure immediately. The relocation to the new plot proceeded without incident. Mrs. Davidson was installed in her family section, and the Davidson family seemed satisfied with the process. But as I drove back to the funeral home, I couldn't shake the image of that smile or Margaret's comment about secrets. That evening, I compared my documentation photos with some notes I'd made during the inspection. The smile was definitely new, definitely inconsistent with the original preparation. But more disturbing was the sense that it conveyed intention, not just a random facial configuration, but an expression that meant something. I never mentioned the inconsistency to my supervisor or included it in my official report. Some observations are too unsettling to document, especially when you can't explain them rationally. Instead, I filed the photos and tried to forget about Mrs. Davidson's impossible smile. But 2 weeks later, Margaret Davidson called the funeral home. Her mother's former neighbor had found an envelope in Mrs. Davidson's mailbox, addressed to Margaret but never delivered. Inside was a letter detailing the location of some family jewelry that had been missing for years, along with information about a safety deposit box that no one in the family had known about. The letter was dated just 3 days before Mrs. Davidson's death, but it had never been mailed. The neighbor had found it stuck behind the mailbox door, as if someone had tried to deliver it, but it had gotten caught. "It's like she wanted to make sure I'd find it eventually," Margaret told our receptionist. Like she was still trying to share her secrets, even after. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but I thought about Mrs. Davidson's smile and what it might have meant. Some expressions transcend death, carrying forward the essence of who someone was in life. And some secrets are too important to stay buried, no matter how deep you plant them. I still take documentation photos before every burial, and I still review them carefully during reinterments. But I pay closer attention now to the subtle changes that time and earth can work on the dead, and I've learned to recognize when a smile means more than simple peace. Time moves forward for the living, but the dead keep their own calendar. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I've been the head records keeper at Woodlawn Cemetery for 14 years. I maintain the burial registers, coordinate plot assignments, and ensure that every interment is properly documented for legal and historical purposes. It's meticulous work that requires absolute accuracy. Families depend on these records for generations, and a single error can cause confusion, legal disputes, or worse. In 14 years, I've processed over 8,000 burial records, and I take pride in maintaining a system that's never failed an audit. That's why the Williams family relocation troubled me so deeply. The request came in during the 3rd week of September, 2024. The Williams family wanted to consolidate their scattered burial plots into a new family section, moving 4 relatives from various locations around the cemetery. Standard procedure required me to pull all the relevant burial records, verify plot ownership, and coordinate with the exhumation crews for the relocations. I started with the oldest burial, Jonathan Williams, interred in Section C, Plot 27 in 1968. The record was handwritten in the careful script that cemetery clerks used before computerization, noting that Jonathan had died on March 15th and was buried 3 days later. Everything looked normal, proper signatures, correct plot designation, fees paid in full. But as I continued reviewing the file, I found a second entry that stopped me cold. Below Jonathan's burial record, in the same handwriting and apparently the same ink, was an entry for someone named Edmund Carver. According to this record, Edmund had died on September 28th, 2024, and was buried in the same plot as Jonathan Williams. September 28th was 3 days after the Williams exhumation was scheduled. I stared at the entry for several minutes, checking and rechecking the dates. The exhumation was set for September 25th. Edmund Carver's recorded death date was September 28th. But the entry was written in the same faded brown ink as the other records from 1968, in handwriting that matched the original cemetery clerk's style perfectly. It was impossible on multiple levels. Cemetery plots don't contain multiple unrelated burials unless specifically designated as family plots with multiple spaces. The Williams family had purchased a single burial plot, not a shared space. And most disturbing of all, the record showed someone dying and being buried 3 days in the future, written in 56-year-old ink. I pulled the complete plot history to see if there had been any administrative errors or amendments to the original records. But Plot 27 showed only one official burial, Jonathan Williams, in March of 1968. No record of Edmund Carver in any of our digital databases, no payment records, no permit applications, nothing to suggest that a second person had ever been interred there. Yet the physical burial register clearly showed both names, both dates, in identical handwriting and ink. I called the Williams family to ask if they knew anything about Edmund Carver. Margaret Williams, Jonathan's niece, and the family representative for the relocation, said she'd never heard the name. "We've been maintaining grandfather's grave for decades," she said. "There's only one headstone, only one burial. Who is Edmund Carver?" "That's what I'm trying to determine. According to our records, he was buried in the same plot as your grandfather, but the dates don't make sense. Could there have been a mistake? Maybe someone was buried in the wrong plot?" That was possible, but it didn't explain the impossible chronology. Even if Edmund Carver had been mistakenly buried in the Williams plot, his death couldn't have been recorded 3 days before it happened using 50-year-old ink. I decided to examine the burial register more carefully. The entry for Edmund Carver was written in the same careful script as Jonathan Williams' record, with no variation in pen pressure, ink color, or letter formation that would suggest it was added later. Even under magnification, the ink appeared to be the same age as the surrounding entries. The paper showed no signs of alteration, erasure, or overwriting. By every physical measure, both entries had been written at the same time, by the same person, using the same materials. But that was chronologically impossible. On September 25th, the exhumation crew arrived to relocate Jonathan Williams. I was present to supervise the procedure and verify that we were accessing the correct burial. The crew raised the concrete vault and prepared to remove the casket for transport to the new family section. When they opened the vault, we found 2 caskets. The first was a standard 1968 bronze casket with a nameplate reading, "Jonathan Williams, beloved father and husband." The second was a newer casket, dark wood with brass fittings, bearing a nameplate that read, "Edmund Carver, rest in peace." "There's been a mistake," Margaret Williams said immediately. "That second casket doesn't belong here. We don't know any Edmund Carver." I checked the plot boundaries against our survey maps. We were definitely in the right location, Plot 27, Section C, registered to the Williams family since 1968. But somehow, the plot contained 2 caskets, one of which belonged to someone who, according to our records, wouldn't die for another 3 days. The exhumation crew chief, a man named Rodriguez who'd been doing this work for over 20 years, looked as confused as I felt. "I've never seen anything like this," he said. 2 caskets in a single burial plot, and this second one looks maybe 5 or 6 years old, not 56. We had to make a decision. The Williams family wanted only their grandfather relocated, but we couldn't leave an unidentified burial in the plot. I called our legal department for guidance, and they advised us to proceed with both exhumations and sort out the administrative details afterward. As we lifted Edmund Carver's casket from the vault, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The casket was exactly the right size for the vault space, like it had been specifically manufactured to fit alongside Jonathan Williams' burial. But the vault had been poured in 1968 as a single occupancy space. There shouldn't have been room for a second casket. The Williams family insisted they had no knowledge of Edmund Carver, no family connection, no explanation for why he would be buried in their plot. They agreed to allow us to relocate his remains to an unoccupied plot until we could determine his proper disposition. That evening, I researched Edmund Carver in every database I could access. No birth certificate, no death certificate, no social security records, no property ownership, no marriage license, nothing to prove he had ever existed. But his casket was real, his remains were real, and his burial record was written in our official register using 50-year-old ink. 3 days later, on September 28th, the date recorded as Edmund Carver's death, I received a call from Riverside Funeral Home. They had a body ready for burial, a man named Edmund Carver, who had died that morning of natural causes. The funeral director wanted to schedule the burial for the following week. "We don't have any record of a plot purchase for Edmund Carver," I told him. "That's strange," the funeral director replied. "His paperwork shows he's already been buried at Woodlawn, Plot 27, Section C, but that can't be right, because we've had his body here since this morning." I drove to Riverside Funeral Home that afternoon and examined their Edmund Carver. He was an elderly man, maybe 75, with the kind of unremarkable features that would be easy to forget. But his face was familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't until I was driving home that I realized where I'd seen him before. During the exhumation 3 days earlier, when we'd opened the casket we'd found in Plot 27, I'd glimpsed the face of the man inside. It was the same face. Edmund Carver had died on September 28th, exactly as recorded in our burial register. But we'd exhumed his body 3 days before his death, from a grave that had been written in our records using 50-year-old ink. I never found an explanation for the chronological impossibility or the duplicate burial records. The Williams family took possession of their grandfather's remains, and Edmund Carver was buried in a new plot using proper 21st century procedures. Both burials are now properly documented in our digital system. But the original burial register still shows both names in that same careful script, in ink that laboratory testing confirms is from the 1960s. Some records, it seems, are written before the events they document, by hands that understand time differently than the rest of us. I still maintain the cemetery records with absolute accuracy, but I've learned that accuracy doesn't always align with possibility. Some dates are more suggestion than fact, and some burials happen before death has officially occurred. Some flowers bloom in darkness, and some mourners prefer to remain unseen. My name is James Kovac, and I've been working night security at Restwood Cemetery for 6 years. I patrol the grounds from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., checking for vandalism, monitoring the surveillance system, and making sure the place stays peaceful during the hours when most people prefer not to think about death. It's quiet work that suits just me, the night air, and rows of headstones catching moonlight. In 6 years, I've seen raccoons, the occasional fox, teenagers looking for a place to drink, and grieving family members who couldn't wait for daylight to visit their loved ones. What I hadn't seen until this past spring were the midnight flowers. The pattern started in March of 2024 during the Martinelli family exhumation. We were scheduled to relocate Mrs. Martinelli from the old section to the new family mausoleum, a routine job that required minimal overnight preparation. I'd marked the site on my patrol route to keep an eye on the equipment staging area, making sure nothing got disturbed before the crew arrived in the morning. On my 11:30 rounds, the exhumation site looked exactly as expected, orange safety cones marking the perimeter, excavation equipment positioned for easy access, work orders taped to a temporary signpost, standard preparation for a 7 a.m. start time. But when I made my 3 a.m. patrol, there were flowers. A perfect arrangement of white lilies, maybe 24 stems, laid carefully on the grass directly over Mrs. Martinelli's grave. They weren't in a vase or container, just arranged in a neat circle with the blooms pointing outward, like someone had taken considerable time to position each stem precisely. The flowers looked fresh, with no signs of wilting despite the cool March air. My first thought was that the Martinelli family had visited during the evening to leave a final tribute before the exhumation. Families sometimes do that, bringing flowers or personal items to mark the end of one phase of burial and the beginning of another. But the timing seemed odd. Most families prefer to make those gestures during daylight hours, and I hadn't seen any vehicles in the parking area during my earlier rounds. I checked the surveillance footage on my portable monitor, reviewing the cameras that covered the Martinelli section. From 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., the footage showed nothing, no people, no vehicles, no movement, except for the occasional deer crossing between sections. Yet sometime during those 4 hours, someone had placed a carefully arranged circle of white lilies on the grave. The flowers were gone when the excavation crew arrived at 7 a.m. I watched them set up their equipment, and by the time I finished my shift report, the lily arrangement had completely disappeared. No scattered petals, no stems left behind, nothing to indicate that flowers had ever been there. I mentioned it to the day supervisor, but he just shrugged and suggested that maybe the wind had blown them away. That seemed unlikely. The lilies had been too carefully arranged to just scatter randomly, and there hadn't been any significant wind overnight. 2 weeks later, we had another exhumation scheduled. The Rodriguez family was consolidating 3 burials into a new family plot, and I'd marked all 3 sites for overnight monitoring. On my midnight patrol, all 3 graves looked normal. By my 4 a.m. rounds, each site had the same white lily arrangement, perfect circles of fresh blooms positioned directly over the burial locations. This time, I was determined to catch whoever was placing the flowers. I positioned myself with a clear view of the Rodriguez section and waited. From midnight to dawn, I watched those graves continuously, using binoculars to scan for any movement. I saw nothing. No people, no vehicles, no activity of any kind. Yet when I approached the graves at sunrise, the lily arrangements were there, as perfect and fresh, as if they'd been delivered by a professional florist moments before. Again, the flowers disappeared when the excavation crew arrived. I started documenting the pattern more carefully. Every exhumation site, without exception, received the white lily treatment the night before digging began. The arrangements were always identical, roughly 24 stems arranged in a perfect circle, blooms pointing outward, no container or backing material. The flowers appeared sometime between midnight and 4 a.m., despite constant surveillance showing no human activity in those areas. Most disturbing of all, the lilies were always absolutely fresh. No wilting, no brown edges, no signs of having spent hours exposed to outdoor conditions. They looked like they'd been cut and arranged moments before I found them, regardless of weather conditions or time of exposure. I asked the families about the flowers, thinking maybe they'd hired a florist for overnight delivery as part of some tradition I wasn't familiar with. Every family gave me the same response. They hadn't ordered flowers, didn't know anything about lily arrangements, and had never heard of overnight floral tributes. I called our contracted florist, Petals and Stems, to ask if they offered midnight delivery services or if they'd received any unusual orders for white lilies. The owner, Mrs. Chen, told me something that made me even more uncomfortable. "We don't carry white lilies," she said. "Haven't for years. They're too associated with death, and most people prefer roses or mixed arrangements for cemetery flowers. I'd have to special order white lilies, and I haven't done that in probably 3 years." I started paying closer attention to the surveillance system, reviewing footage frame by frame to see if I was missing something. The cameras were high definition, with excellent night vision capability, and they covered every section of the cemetery with multiple angles. But no matter how carefully I analyzed the recordings, they never showed anyone placing flowers on the graves. The flowers simply appeared, as if they materialized from the darkness itself. In May, during the Henderson family triple exhumation, I decided to try a more direct approach. I positioned myself within 50 feet of one of the grave sites, hidden behind a large monument, but with a clear view of the burial location. If someone was placing flowers, I'd see them regardless of camera angles or blind spots. From midnight until 4 a.m., I watched that grave without blinking. I used night vision binoculars, checked the site every few minutes, and never looked away for more than seconds at a time. The grave remained undisturbed throughout my vigil. No visitors. No movement, no sign of any activity. But when I approached the site at dawn, the white lilies were there. 24 perfect stems arranged in the familiar circle, fresh as if they'd just been cut. I knelt down and examined them closely, looking for any clue about their origin. The stems were clean, with no soil or debris that might indicate where they'd been grown. The cuts were precise, made with sharp floral shears. The blooms were fully opened, but not overblown, suggesting they'd been harvested at the perfect moment for maximum beauty. They were the most beautiful lilies I'd ever seen, and they shouldn't have existed. As I crouched beside the arrangement, I became aware of a presence behind me. Not a sound, exactly, but a sense that someone was watching. I turned slowly, scanning the area around the Henderson grave, but saw nothing except headstones and mourning shadows. Yet the feeling persisted, the distinct sensation that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was observing my examination of their floral tribute. The air felt cooler suddenly, despite the warming sunrise, and I found myself reluctant to touch the lily stems. I stood up and backed away from the arrangement, and as I did, I could have sworn I heard a whisper. Not words, exactly, but a soft sound like wind through leaves, except there was no wind, and the nearest trees were 50 yards away. The excavation crew arrived 30 minutes later, and by the time they'd positioned their equipment, the lilies had vanished again. No trace remained of the perfect arrangement, just empty grass ready for digging. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've witnessed the midnight lily phenomenon dozens of times, always following the same pattern. Perfect arrangements appearing overnight, disappearing at dawn, captured by no camera, and placed by no visible hand. I've stopped trying to catch whoever is leaving the flowers. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved by the living, and some tributes are too sacred to investigate too closely. The dead have their own way of saying goodbye, and their own mourners who prefer to work in darkness. But I think about those lilies every night as I patrol the cemetery grounds, and I've come to understand that some flowers bloom not from soil and sunlight, but from love that transcends death itself. The midnight arrangements aren't random, they're farewells, placed by hands that remember tenderness even after the heart has stopped beating. I still document their appearance in my security reports, but I no longer question their origin. Some gifts are meant to remain mysterious, and some goodbye rituals are too beautiful to explain away. The earth remembers every burden it's asked to bear, and sometimes it tries to give them back. My name is Maria Santos, and I've been a vault technician at Hillside Memorial Cemetery for 11 years. I specialize in concrete burial vaults, installing them, maintaining them, and occasionally relocating them when families need to consolidate plots or move to different sections. It's technical work that requires precision and attention to detail, because these vaults protect caskets from ground pressure and water infiltration for decades. In 11 years, I've installed over 3,000 vaults, and I understand how they settle, how they age, and what sounds they make as the earth shifts around them. That's why the Peterson vault relocation troubled me so deeply. The job came in during the second week of April, 2024. Harold Peterson had been buried in Section B 15 years earlier, and his family wanted to move him to the new Veterans Section, where they could install a proper military marker. Standard relocation procedure: excavate the vault, transport it to the new location, and reinstall it according to current specifications. The Peterson vault was a good one, heavy-duty concrete with proper seals and no signs of deterioration despite 15 years underground. We raised it cleanly, moved it across the cemetery to Plot 17 in the Veterans Section, and reinstalled it with fresh concrete footings. The whole job took 6 hours and went exactly according to protocol. I always check my work by walking the sites for a few days after completion, making sure there's no settling issues or ground instability that might affect the installation. It's professional habit vault. Failures are rare, but when they happen, They cause enormous problems for families and liability issues for the cemetery. 3 days after the Peterson relocation, I was doing my evening rounds when I heard the sound. It was coming from the empty plot in Section B where Harold Peterson had originally been buried. A dragging sound, like heavy furniture being moved across a floor, followed by what sounded like objects being repositioned. The sounds were muffled but distinct, definitely coming from underground, and they had a rhythmic quality that suggested deliberate activity rather than random settling. I stopped and listened carefully. The dragging continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. After a brief pause, it started again. Drag, pause, shift, pause, drag again. Like someone was rearranging the contents of a room, taking time to consider the positioning of each piece. But the plot was empty. We'd removed the vault 3 days earlier, backfilled the excavation with clean soil, and left nothing but level ground. There was nothing underground to make dragging sounds. I marked the time 6:45 p.m., just as the sun was setting and made a note to check the area in the morning. Sometimes newly backfilled soil creates air pockets that collapse and make unusual sounds as they settle. It wasn't common, but it was possible. The next evening, I made sure to be in Section B around sunset. At exactly 6:45, the sounds started again. Same dragging noises, same rhythmic pattern, same sense that something heavy was being moved around underground. But this time, I noticed something else. The sound seemed to be coming from different locations within the plot area, like whatever was making them was moving from one side to the other. I called Rodriguez, our senior groundskeeper, to get a second opinion. He arrived just as the sounds were starting their evening routine. "You hear that?" I asked. Rodriguez listened intently, his face growing more concerned as the dragging continued. "That's not settling," he said finally. "Settling doesn't move around like that, and it doesn't happen on schedule." "What do you think it is?" "I don't know, but it's not natural. Ground doesn't rearrange itself every evening at the same time." We stood there for 10 minutes, listening to the underground activity. The sounds were consistent dragging, pausing, shifting, repositioning, like someone was systematically moving heavy objects from place to place, organizing them according to some plan we couldn't understand. When the sound stopped, Rodriguez and I examined the plot surface for any signs of movement or subsidence. The ground looked normal level, properly compacted, no cracks or depressions that might indicate underground instability. But we could both feel that something was wrong beneath our feet. "We need to take a look," Rodriguez said. "This could be a serious structural issue." Getting permission to re-excavate a recently backfilled plot required approval from the cemetery director and notification of the Peterson family. It took 3 days of paperwork and explanation, but we finally got authorization to investigate the source of the sounds. The excavation began on a Thursday morning. As we dug down to the original vault level, everything looked normal, clean soil, proper compaction, no signs of voids or instability. But when we reached the depth where the Peterson vault had been installed, we found something that shouldn't have been there. The concrete walls of the original vault excavation were still intact. When we'd removed the Peterson vault, we should have been left with an empty hole that we'd backfilled with soil. But the concrete walls that had been poured around the vault 15 years earlier were still standing, forming an empty concrete box about 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. "That's impossible," Rodriguez said, staring into the empty vault space. "We broke those walls when we extracted the vault. I saw them crack and crumble." I checked our work orders and photographs from the Peterson relocation. The documentation clearly showed that we'd broken through the concrete walls to extract the vault, leaving nothing but broken concrete fragments that should have been removed with the rest of the debris. But here were the walls, intact and solid, as if they'd never been disturbed. More disturbing were the stress fractures that had developed in the concrete since the vault's removal. The walls were covered with hairline cracks that formed distinct patterns, not random stress fractures, but deliberate configurations that looked almost like writing. "Those look like letters," Rodriguez said, pointing to a section of the east wall where the cracks formed what might have been an H and an E. I studied the fracture patterns more carefully. The cracks were definitely forming letter-like shapes, though they were hard to read because they were scattered across all four walls without obvious organization. Some letters were clear H, E, L, poi, while others were ambiguous or incomplete. "It's like someone's trying to write something," I said, though the idea seemed ridiculous even as I spoke it. We photographed the fracture patterns and called in Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a structural engineer who consulted for the cemetery on vault installations. She examined the concrete walls and confirmed that the stress fractures were unusual, too regular to be random, too purposeful to be accidental. "Concrete doesn't crack like this naturally," she said. "These patterns suggest that pressure was applied from inside the vault space in very specific ways. But there's nothing inside to create that kind of pressure." The fractures continued to develop over the following days. Each evening, as the dragging sounds occurred, new cracks appeared in the concrete walls, adding to the letter-like patterns. We documented everything, but none of us could decipher what the message might be trying to say. The letters seemed to be scattered randomly: H on the east wall, E and L on the north wall, P on the west wall. If it was meant to be a word or message, it wasn't organized in any way we could read. On the fifth day of investigation, I was examining the south wall when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The fractures on that wall were forming what looked like a date: 4/15/24. April 15th, 2024, the exact date we'd relocated the Peterson vault. That evening, I stood at the edge of the excavation and listened to the dragging sounds with new understanding. They weren't random noises or settling ground. They were the sounds of someone trying to rearrange the letters, trying to organize them into a readable message. The concrete walls were covered with stress fractures that spelled out individual letters, and something underground was trying to move those letters around, trying to arrange them in the right order to communicate something important. As I listened to the dragging and shifting, I found myself thinking about Harold Peterson and what he might be trying to say. The man had been a veteran, a father, someone who'd lived a full life before his death 15 years earlier. What message could be so important that it would fracture concrete walls from beyond the grave? We eventually backfilled the excavation and restored the plot to its original condition. The Peterson family was never told about the fracture patterns or the impossible concrete walls. Some discoveries are too unsettling to share, especially when they suggest that the dead might be trying to communicate with the living. But I still think about those stress fractures and what they might have spelled out if we'd been able to read them properly. Sometimes, when I'm working evening shifts and the sun is setting, I can hear faint dragging sounds from various sections of the cemetery, like underground voices trying to rearrange the letters of words we're not ready to understand. The earth remembers everything we bury in it, and sometimes what we bury has something to say. Mathematics don't lie, but the earth sometimes refuses to follow the rules. My name is David Kellerman, and I've been an excavation foreman for cemetery services for 30 years. I've dug more graves than I care to count, moved more earth than some construction crews, and I know the physics of soil displacement better than any textbook. After 30 years, certain habits become second nature: measuring depths, calculating volumes, counting loads. It's not just professional thoroughness. It's a way of maintaining order in work that deals with endings and transitions. One habit I've never broken is counting shovels. When we excavate a plot, I count every shovelful of earth that comes out. When we backfill, I count every shovelful that goes back in. The numbers should match, minus the volume displaced by the casket or vault. It's basic mathematics, and in 30 years, the math has never failed me. Until the Miller family transfer. The job came through in late October of 2024. Standard family relocation: Margaret Miller needed to be moved from her original burial site to the new family section where her husband had recently been interred. She'd been buried for 2 years in a well-drained section of Oakwood Cemetery, and the family wanted them together in the premium area they'd purchased. I assembled my regular crew, Johnson and Martinez on shovels, Peters operating the small excavator for the heavy lifting. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect conditions for excavation work. I started my count as soon as we began digging. The Miller plot was standard dimensions 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep to the top of the concrete vault. As we excavated, I kept my running tally. Shovel loads 1 through 15 to clear the surface soil, loads 16 through 45 for the main excavation, loads 46 through 63 to expose the vault completely. 63 shovelfuls of earth removed from the Miller plot. I wrote the number in my daily log, just like always. The vault came out clean, no complications, and we loaded it onto the transport trailer for the move to the new section. Standard procedure was to leave the excavation open until after the reinterment, then backfill both holes in sequence to maximize crew efficiency. The reinterment went smoothly. Mrs. Miller was installed in her new location next to her husband's recent grave, and the family seemed satisfied with the arrangement. That left us with the backfill work first, the new plot, then the original Miller site. I always save the original excavation for last, because it's the most straightforward. Just fill the hole with the same earth that came out of it, tamp it down properly, and restore the grade to match the surrounding area. Simple mathematics. 63 shovelfuls out, 63 shovelfuls back in, accounting for compaction. We started backfilling the Miller plot at 4:30 in the afternoon. Johnson and Martinez worked systematically, 1 shovelful at a time, while I kept count. After 63 loads, the hole was still noticeably deep. "Keep going," I told them, thinking maybe my morning count had been off. 70 loads, still deep. 75 loads, still at least 18 inches to grade level. By the time we reached 80 shovelfuls, I knew something was wrong. The hole should have been filled and graded by load 65 at the latest, accounting for soil compaction. But we were 17 loads over count, and the excavation still needed more earth to reach proper grade. "You sure about your count this morning?" Johnson asked, breathing hard from the extra work. I checked my logbook. 63 loads out, now 80 loads back in, and we still had excavation visible. The mathematics didn't work. "Peters, get the measuring stick," I called out. Peters brought over our standard depth Rota 6-foot marked pole that we used to verify excavation depths. I dropped it into the center of the partially filled hole and read the measurement. 4 feet, 2 inches from grade level to the bottom of the excavation. According to my calculations, that hole should have been filled to grade level 17 shovelfuls ago, but we were still looking at more than 4 feet of open excavation that needed to be filled. "Maybe the hole caved in while we were gone," Martinez suggested. "Sometimes the walls collapse and make the excavation deeper." That was possible, but I'd checked the Miller plot before we started backfilling, and the walls had been stable. Besides, soil collapse usually creates sloped sides and irregular depths, not the clean vertical walls and flat bottom we were looking at. I called our surveyor, Mike Chen, who happened to be working on another project in the cemetery. Mike brought his transit and shot elevations on the Miller plot, comparing them to the measurements he'd taken that morning during the vault removal. "This is strange," Mike said, checking his figures twice. "The plot dimensions are exactly the same as this morning. 8 feet by 4 feet, clean vertical walls, level bottom. But according to these measurements, the excavation is now 7 feet, 4 inches deep. It was 6 feet deep this morning? Exactly 6 feet to the vault top. I have it documented." Mike showed me his field notes, clearly marked with elevation readings that put the original excavation depth at 6 feet, not 7 feet 4 inches. Somehow, between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., the Miller plot had grown 18 inches deeper. We filled the extra depth with soil from our reserve pile, adding another 23 shovelfuls before reaching proper grade level. My final count showed 103 shovelfuls of earth going into a hole that had yielded only 63 shovelfuls that morning. That's a 40 shovelful discrepancy, roughly 3 cubic yards of earth that had to come from somewhere to fill a hole that had somehow expanded while we weren't looking. That evening, I went back to examine the backfilled Miller plot. The grade was perfect, the soil properly compacted, everything looking exactly as it should after a professional restoration. But the mathematics haunted me. Holes don't grow deeper on their own. Earth doesn't expand in volume without cause. The numbers should have balanced. I started paying closer attention to my counts after that, documenting every excavation and backfill with obsessive precision. Most jobs worked out exactly as expected. The math balanced, the volumes matched, everything proceeded according to the laws of physics. But occasionally, maybe once every month or two, I'd encounter a Miller situation, a hole that needed more earth going back in than had come out of it. Always the math was off by significant amounts in shovelfuls, 15 shovelfuls, once as many as 22 extra loads to reach grade level. I began asking other foremen if they'd noticed similar discrepancies. Most said no, but a few admitted to occasional count problems that they'd attributed to measurement errors or soil settling. None of them tracked their numbers as precisely as I did, so their experiences were harder to quantify. Mike Chen started double-checking measurements on the problematic excavations, confirming that the holes were indeed deeper at backfill time than they had been during excavation. His surveying equipment doesn't lie, and his documentation was meticulous. We were dealing with graves that were growing deeper while we worked on other projects. The pattern seemed random, no correlation with burial age, soil type, weather conditions, or family names. But all the affected graves shared one characteristic. They required significantly more earth to fill than they had yielded during excavation. 6 months later, I'm still counting shovelfuls and still encountering the impossible mathematics. Some graves grow deeper between excavation and backfill, requiring earth that has to come from somewhere else to fill them properly. I've stopped trying to explain it to cemetery management. They're concerned with customer satisfaction and operational efficiency, not with mathematical anomalies that don't affect the final product. As long as the plots are properly restored and the families are satisfied, the count discrepancies are just bookkeeping details. But I continue documenting every load, every measurement, every impossible calculation. After 30 years of excavation work, I've learned that the earth follows its own rules, and those rules don't always align with human mathematics. Some holes are hungrier than others, and some graves require more earth to fill them than they're willing to give up. The final count doesn't always balance, and the missing cubic yards come from a place that surveying equipment can't measure and mathematics can't explain.